Okay, thanks, Henry. Thanks to the trustees and Alex and Beth for inviting me today to talk about the United States and how we waged war. I'm quite flattered to have been asked. And since this is my first time lecturing, I will do a quick intro for those who don't know me. So I'm Allie, and I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. And the picture you see on your screen is actually my hometown, doing a Liberty Loan Parade in September 1917. So today, I decided to play a bit to my strengths. So my background is in poli-sci and I'm a government worker by day. So my presentation is going to kind of talk a bit more about American society, politics and bureaucracy, and less so on like the fighting parts, which we'll talk about it a little bit, but I apologize if you were looking really forward to that. I'm going to do a quick drive-by of a lot of different themes, and there's some things I will miss outright. And one of them in particular I know is how the women's role in the war. So I'm sorry about that. And there's some things that I just don't give nearly enough time to, but hopefully this gives you a flavor and some more things to learn about. So I'm going to start with a quote, and it's a little bit of audience participation. Just take a second to read. I'll read it out loud. Think to yourself who you think said it. And I know there's Americans here, and I know you should get this one. If you're bold, you can put it in the chat. You don't have to. Europe has a set of primary interests, which to us have none or a very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics or the ordinary combinations and collusions of her friendships or enmities. Our detached and distant situation invites us and enables us to pursue a different course. So we just celebrated this guy's birthday. And if you guessed George Washington, you were right. So this comes from George Washington's farewell address, very famous speech. He warns us both about neutrality and getting tied up in alliances, but he also warns us about partisan politics. So I think he was at least right about that one. And why am I quoting him to you right now when it was 118 years before the war started? Well, this is the prevailing attitude in the United States, even at the beginning of the 20th century. And it kind of goes to show just how remarkable it was that we were going to get embroiled in a global conflict. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit and provide some context, just like other presenters have done. Domestically in the United States, we really like to contextualize the First World War through the lens of the Second World War. And I think that's something we need to get away from because it really does it a disservice. So the United States, this is from the 1910 census. So we have roughly 92 million people in 48 states. And another 9 million in our outlying areas. So that's like Alaska and Hawaii, which are not states yet, Guam, Samoa, Philippines, and Puerto Rico. So total population, 101 million. America is becoming more urban. The percentage of Americans in cities of 2,500 or more in 1910 is about 46%. And that's compared with 30% in 1880. This is also the beginning of what we call the Great Migration, where approximately 6 million Black people are going to move from the South to the North, Midwest, and Northwest. And the center of population is still moving westward. This kind of gets curbed by the war. We are the richest country in the world in both aggregate and per capita wealth, but we are a debtor country. And similar to the rest of the world, manufacturing is increasing and agricultural output is declining. And we see on the map there kind of a nice little breakdown of the different parts of the country that we acquired over the course of the 19th century, with particular attention paid to that bit in the Southwest, which we got from Mexico. So in the late 19th century, we have what's called the Gilded Age, and you have immense new concentrations of private economic power, but you also have increasing income inequality. And that leads into what we call the Progressive Era. In America, we love to give like names to our different parts of history. And so the Progressive Era is all about expanding public regulation over the economy, believing the government should actively pursue the public interest. We passed the 16th Amendment, which is a progressive income tax. And so in the 1912 election, Democrat Woodrow Wilson beats incumbent William Howard Taft. Now, this is in part because the Republican Party is split by Theodore Roosevelt, who is a former president himself, and he's not a big fan of Taft. So he creates the Progressive Bull Moose Party, and that's Teddy up top with the bull moose. And like I said, Wilson is elected on progressive principles. He expects to be a domestic president. On the eve of his inauguration, he says, It would be the irony of fate if my administration had to deal with chiefly foreign affairs. And America is now acknowledging the fact that for hundreds of years prior to the arrival of Europeans, there were thousands of people living on the continent. America, as we conceptualize it, is an immigrant nation. And for the majority of the 19th century, we're fairly comfortable that way. However, we start to see waves of what are called new immigrants. These are immigrants coming more from Eastern Europe than Western, so comprising people from Italy, Austria, Hungary, and the Balkans. And after 1886, that's where the majority of European immigration is coming from. And this is very different from the usual immigrants we're used to. They're Catholic, they're Orthodox, they're Jewish. They have different customs. Sometimes they're illiterate. And there's also a labor element here in that they provide very cheap labor, and they're often used to break strikes. So what all of this means is that there is an increase in anti-immigration sentiment in the United States. This is where we see the origin of the term of the illegal immigrant. And so basically in the turn of the century, you're seeing massive, massive flows of immigration. The year 1907 is the year Ellis Island processes the largest number of immigrants. And those pictures on the left are from Ellis Island. And then on your screen, you'll see just a chart of some statistics from the 1910 census. So 13.5 million people right now are born overseas, which is 14% of the US population. And that includes 8 million German Americans. You'll see they are the highest number of native born and also the highest number of second generation. And the chart also reflects the trends I shared about the new versus old immigrants. So second generation, lots of Italian, lots of Irish, lots of English, lots of Canadians. But the newer immigrants arriving are from Austria, Hungary, Russia, etc. So I'll talk just briefly about German Americans because they comprise such a big part of the immigrant population. So Germans in this country have been coming since the beginning. We have a wave in the 1830s and 50s. You have about 215,000 arriving in a population of about 25 million total. And then in the late 1800s, you have a massive influx. So from 1881 to 1892, approximately 1.7 million are going to arrive in America from Germany. And pictured here are just some of that 1.7 million. They are the Kimlingers. They left Baldringen in the Rhineland, which is near Trier, in 1884 for the US. So the nice man in the top right is my great-grandfather, Peter Paul. And in the middle and the bottom is his father, John, next to my great-great-grandmother, Maria. So after a brief stay in Ohio, they go and settle in a part of rural Minnesota, and they are not alone. So here's a map from 1914 showing the concentration of native-born German Americans. More than 85% of German Americans are going to reside in the mid-Atlantic states and in the Midwest, although they're distributed across most US cities. German is by far the most common non-English language spoken by first or second generation immigrants. And when the US enters the war in 1917, there are 522 German language publications in the US. That's nearly as great as all the other foreign language publications combined. Now, German Americans have very vigorous ethnic institutions. They're attached to their culture, their language, their literature, art, philosophy, but not Germany as a political unit. These organizations rarely have any link to Germany and rarely have any political loyalty to the German state. In the early 20th century, German Americans are pretty well accepted by American society. The American stereotypes of Germans fit pretty well with American stereotypes. They're industrious, they're thrift, hardworking, and honest. And Americans actually admire a lot about Germany. However, they don't see the Kaiser and the German state in a favorable light. It's also worth noting that among German Americans, you have provincial differences, religious divisions, social political distinctions, but most of this is going to be lost on the average American. So let's talk now briefly about the US military, US foreign policy leading up to the First World War. So last great conflict we had was, of course, the US Civil War, bloodiest conflict in our history, took place from 1860 to 65. Now, after the Civil War, the size of the army just completely shrinks, and it becomes basically just a constabulary force on the Western plains. We're dealing with the Native Americans and enforcing American policies there that, frankly, aren't so nice. But then at the end of the 19th century, we have the splendid little war, the Spanish-American War. The US has been supporting revolutions in Cuba to get Spain's influence out of our hemisphere. This has to do with a thing called the Monroe Doctrine. And the takeaways here are basically that the logistics are a hot mess. Us getting our men to Cuba is just complete chaos. But ultimately, the march up San Juan Hill brings Teddy Roosevelt to fame. And there's also a man leading the 10th Cavalry, Captain John Pershing. As an outcome of the Spanish-American War, the Philippines are now ours, so we have to deal with a series of conflicts with the Filipinos. They're not super happy about being under the thumb of another foreign power, and we have constant issues with Mexico. So a couple decades before the Civil War, we had the Mexican-American War, the result of which is the Mexican Cession, which gives us the modern-day American Southwest, like you saw on that map. And in the early 1900s, Mexico is embroiled with its own civil war, and the US has a vested interest in Mexico. We share a border, but also they have 25% of the world's oil reserves. When in doubt, follow the oil. So in 1915, we have Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa. He's not so happy with the United States because we decided to throw our support on against his rival. Comes into the United States, town called Columbus, New Mexico, kills some civilians, wreaks havoc. And Wilson can't do nothing. So he sends an expedition into Mexico, led by a General John J. Pershing, to hunt him down. Lasts about a year. We never get him. We kill a bunch of his guys. And as this is going on, the war is waging on the Western Front. But in our army, this is at least the first time we use airplanes for reconnaissance, wireless operators for communication, lorries for supply. So we start to utilize some of these more modern technologies, but we are like years behind what is happening on the Western Front. So then we have the war. When a war breaks out, public sentiment is still very isolationist. We do not want to get involved in a European conflict. You have folks leaning towards both sides based off of their heritage or their general opinions. Irish Americans in particular are not going to be inclined to want to support Britain, although they won't go so far as to support Germany. The Jewish community is going to be very anti-Russia. They also see the Dreyfus Affair in France as something that demonstrates anti-Semitism in France. And they actually view Germany and Austria-Hungary as more tolerant of Jews. And there's also this prevailing idea of the time called the two Germanys. So the two Germanys is this concept that there was a difference between the Prussian autocracy and the German people. The 1870 unification had imposed a domineering militaristic leadership on a very scientific and humanistic Germany of years past. So we basically see the German people as victims of their own government. And German immigrants had sought to escape the regime, which is very anti-Catholic, over-militaristic, and they kind of bring this concept with them. Now, as things develop in 1914, opinion will start to shift. The Germans' actions in Belgium are viewed as barbaric, and this is helped along by British propaganda. So as soon as war breaks out, the British cut the transatlantic cable. So everything that comes to the United States has to go through London censors. The Germans, meanwhile, have to communicate with their embassies through coded radio transmissions. Now, American public is going to be a huge factor for Wilson, and the British are in tune to this. So they have a division under the War Propaganda Bureau at Wellington House called the American Ministry of Information. It's aimed at key influential individuals like politicians, professors, and journalists. And it's also worth noting that the Americans right now have very limited intelligence gathering capabilities, just an occasional radio interception or gossip passed on through the US ambassador to Germany. So the British have a much more sophisticated operation going on, and they're going to be routinely intercepting American diplomatic cables. So Wilson personally, he's very pro-ally. He fears a German victory, but he, at least in 1914, does not want his personal feelings to affect America's official neutrality. So in a statement to the press on August 18th, he urges, the United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these times. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action. So he's suspicious of the hyphenated Americans, and which are the immigrants. And ultimately, he wants to have America play a role as brokering peace talks, which is why he really wants us to be viewed as a neutral party. I'm going to take a quick sip. So here's our cast of characters. We've talked a bit about Wilson. Wilson is a Southerner. He's born in Virginia and grew up in Georgia. He witnessed the Civil War and its aftermath, which leaves a big impression on him. He's an intellectual, so he goes to Princeton University, New Jersey, gets a doctorate in political science, and he doesn't join politics until he's elected governor of New Jersey in 1910. His cabinet is full of Southern Democrats, which is his base of support. The Democratic coalition also has working class Northeasterners, the Irish, and Midwestern farmers. Next to Wilson, we have Edward Mandell House. So he's known to a lot as Colonel House. He never served in the military. This is just a nickname he was given. And Colonel House is a very close confidant of Wilson's. He also grew up in the South. He also witnessed the aftermath of the Civil War. And so they have a mutual belief in peace. Wilson counts on House to be a back channel diplomat in Europe. He holds no official title in Wilson's cabinet. He was offered whatever position he wanted and he refused. He basically said, I just want to go where I'm useful. So what House is going to be in Europe in the spring of 1914, and he's going to make regular trips to London, Berlin, and Paris throughout the war. Wilson notably uses him instead of his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan is a very prominent Democrat. He ran for president twice unsuccessfully, and he's given the title or the position of Secretary of State, which is very prestigious. It's one of the most sought after cabinet positions. He's very helpful to Wilson in passing domestic legislation early in his presidency, but Wilson does not rely on him like he relies on House. Bryan is a staunch isolationist, advocates for strict American neutrality, and is firmly committed to it. Lastly, I have Herbert Hoover on screen. So Hoover is a man who has a pretty bad reputation in like popular American memory because of his connotations with the Great Depression. But I'm going to try and change your opinion of Hoover because he probably saved more lives than any other American leader. Hoover was born in Iowa. He was an orphan. He was part of the inaugural class at Stanford University, and he becomes a self-made man through the mining industry. He ends up working for a London-based company with operations in Australia and China. Now, he also has no formal position right away at the outbreak of war. He's living in London, and he will play a pivotal role in what follows. So let's stay neutral. Well, it's pretty much going to be impossible for a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones is the economy. In the years leading up to the war, 77% of all US exports go to a belligerent country, more to the UK than to Germany, by roughly 594 million to the UK and 344 million to Germany. And actually, the initial shock of the outbreak of the war is really bad for the US economy. We have large cotton and wheat harvests that have nowhere to go. We don't have any ships because we can pretty much entirely depend on foreign shipping. And these are now needed by the belligerent countries for the war efforts. Because of the rush of creditors wanting to get their money, the stock exchange has to close for 4 months. And England fully owns half of the world's merchant marine. So they're going to want to have a say in what goods can be shipped on their vessels. The British blockade of the North Sea becomes problematic. Americans are big proponents of an open market. We demand freedom of the seas. And meanwhile, London releases an extensive list of contraband items that can't be shipped to Germany or any of the Central Powers. And it goes beyond just weapons and ammunition. So, for example, we have the Wilhelmina. So the Wilhelmina is a ship privately owned by an American company. And in January 1915, it is carrying a cargo of food bound for Germany. Since Germany had passed a measure making all foodstuff liable to confiscation for the German army, the British say that all US shipments to Germany are subject to seizure. In response, the Germans exempt the food shipments from neutrals from the order, but the British seize the Wilhelmina anyway. This causes the Germans to announce a submarine blockade of the British Isles. So as we get into 1915 now, the Allies are going to grow more and more dependent on foreign sources for war material. So the American economy is going to pivot and recover by meeting this need. The US will be selling oil, barbed wire, rifle ammunition, plus the steel and copper needed to make these weapons. Horses and mules are sold from Midwestern farms. And in a great example of integrated supply chains, we have workers in Canada using American parts and materials to assemble submarines. So it's like your British's little back door into the United States. We're also selling to other allies, but it is next to impossible to sell to Germany and other Central Powers due to the blockade. There is some shipping through neutral countries, sort of as a back channel to get things to Germany, but then the British are also going to want to start seizing those vessels. So what happens is America ultimately ends up in a state that de facto advantages the Allies. Because of the blockade and also because of pre-war trends, the US is in a position that's predisposed to trade with Britain and France. Sale of these munitions is a massive economic benefit to America. So we're going to keep trading, even though it's going to clearly favor one side. And Wilson's decision on this is nothing gives him the power legally to intervene, so he won't. Basically the idea is like, if there's any action we make, it could be considered unneutral as benefiting one or the other. So the action to not do anything is what we do. And I always like to say, it's like, if you don't make a decision, you're making a decision. But basically, Wilson just lets it happen. And he really doesn't want the American economy to suffer. So the Germans become really bitter about this, the fact that American ammunition is supplying the British, and this is going to have implications. Meanwhile, the American people themselves aren't going to stay uninvolved. France and America are historic allies. You have a lot of Americans with a great admiration for the French culture. And so hundreds will volunteer in the French Foreign Legion. We have the very famous Lafayette Escadrille, the Air Squadron. And you also have substantial numbers of Americans volunteering in the BEF, but particularly the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So the numbers are roughly 40,000. It's a rough number based off of my research. It's just kind of hard to say exactly, but that's the estimate. And notably, the majority of those that actually serve in the CEF are after US entry into the war. However, you do have instances like the 97th Battalion, which is out of Toronto. They have a recruiting office with an American flag out front, and they call themselves the American Legion. You have recruitment happening on American soil, even though it's not supposed to. It violates the American Foreign Enlistment Act, but it still happens. I have a number of individuals I researched that on their paperwork that they'll give maybe locally here, it'll say they enlisted in Minneapolis, but then on the Canadian record, it'll say they enlisted in Winnipeg. So there are definitely recruitment offices happening in major cities in the United States, especially the northern states. And then it's not just military service. It's volunteering for aiding the Allies and refugees in other ways, like the ambulance service and the Red Cross. You have some Americans that may go to the Central Powers, but I'm not finding a lot of data on that. It's not widely reported on. So it was likely not a widespread thing. And you also have tens of thousands of Italian Americans that will return to Italy as well to serve for the Italians. I do want to talk briefly about one organization in particular, because it doesn't get enough attention. It's called the Commission for Relief in Belgium. So like I said, Herbert Hoover is living in London at the outbreak of war. Now, initially, he helps facilitate relief efforts for Americans trapped in England. He lends some petty cash to British businesses. But then he goes on to spearhead Belgian relief, and he organizes the Commission for Relief in Belgium in September 1914. Now, Hoover has no official diplomatic status or experience for that matter. He's just very well connected and very capable. He negotiates with the British to let food aid pass through the blockade, and he works with the Germans to allow the food to go to the non-combatant Belgians. Now, the food is routed through Rotterdam on specially marked ships. Hoover sets up an office in Brussels and crosses the channel multiple times to manage diplomatic and supply chain issues. The CRB has a volunteer network of about 100,000 people, and they rely on private donations as well as some government funds. About 2/3 of these funds are going to come from America, with the other third about or so coming from Britain. And then we also have support from China, Italy, Spain, Holland, and Argentina. So it saves an estimated 9 million people. And the Belgians are very grateful. They use the cotton sacks that the flour comes in, both for clothing, but they also use it to stitch souvenirs that are sent back to the United States. Herbert Hoover is personally given several hundred of these decorated flour sacks. And he also is named a Friend of Belgium and an honorary citizen. He has an open invitation to stop by the Belgian embassy in Washington, D.C. for a drink, and he does this regularly through U.S. prohibition. So back to our drama on the high seas. So I think we're all pretty familiar with the story of the Lusitania, but I couldn't go through this presentation without mentioning it. So on April 26, 1915, the German government reaches out to William Jennings Bryan, Secretary of State, and he says that on its next voyage, the Lusitania will have 6 million rounds of rifle ammunition manufactured by Remington for British Enfield rifles. Permission is requested to print a warning to the American public, which Bryan clears, and it appears in New York newspapers. Now, the Lusitania leaves New York on May 1st, and of the over 1,200 passengers, 159 are American. When it gets to the Irish coast, it's hit by a German torpedo, and 124 of the Americans are killed, a large number of which are children. So the American public is outraged, and the Germans are not particularly apologetic, which only fuels the fire. This marks a substantial shift in U.S. opinion towards the side of the Allies. You have Theodore Roosevelt calling it murder on the high seas, and he and other like-minded influential politicians and journalists and lobbyists are going to start saying we should get into the war on the side of the Allies. House himself advises the president that we can no longer remain neutral spectators. On the other side, however, you have William Jennings Bryan, who wants Wilson to urge Americans not to travel on ships of belligerent countries. He says, a ship carrying contraband should not rely upon passengers to protect her from attack. It would be like putting women and children in front of an army. Wilson wants to steer a middle course. He wants reparations, and he sends a firmly worded telegram to Berlin, and his tone is so severe that it actually causes Bryan to resign. Yet, none of this is enough to bring us into war. Wilson says a few days later that there is such a thing as being too proud to fight. So I mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, and alongside him, you have General Leonard Wood. And these two guys, they're Republicans, and they are interventionists, and they're also proponents of preparedness. This is a movement that starts to appear in 1915, acknowledging that we are completely unprepared for a war. So Leonard Wood, he's the guy up top there, and he's pictured at Plattsburgh. Excuse me. He's active in the Army, and he's a former Army Chief of Staff under President Taft. He decides to establish a series of military training camps to train civilians. It's completely privately funded. It's made up mostly of business and professional men that might make a supplemental officer corps. The cost is $100. It's 35 days. You learn basic drill, marksmanship, and physical fitness. This will end up being replicated throughout the country and become a model for basic training. At the same time, Wilson asks his Secretary of War, Lindley Garrison, to advise on a proper training of our citizens to arms. So Garrison sends him his recommendation, and the War Department had been working on this for a while. And it suggests that you increase the regular army from 108,000 to 141,000, so pretty modest, and establish a 400,000 man reserve. And this is all over the span of 3 years. Now, this is opposed by a lot of people in Congress. There's some issues of states' rights that are part of this when it comes to the National Guard and militias, but also everything gets inflamed when the Army Chief of Staff, Hugh Scott, brings up conscription and testimony to the House Committee on Military Affairs. A direct quote in response to him is, "What do you want with 1 million men? The United States will never be at war with anybody." So Wilson tries to campaign on Garrison's plan, but his heart isn't in it at the time, and he basically just stops supporting it. And then Garrison resigns. This is when Wilson appoints Newton Baker to the position of Secretary of War. So later on in 1915 and into 1916, we have the Pancho Villa raid, we have the sinking of the Sussex, and these things all start to light a fire under Congress and under Wilson in particular to actually get something done. So we do have a National Defense Act passed in 1916. It's very similar to the Garrison Plan, authorizes a peacetime strength of regular army to 175,000 through 5 annual increments. It federalizes the National Guard. So that's what I'm talking about with these state militias. Basically, now these National Guard members take dual oaths to both their state and their federal government. And the president now has the authority to call the National Guard into federal service. Now, this is one of the most comprehensive pieces of military legislation that is passed in peacetime. in our history, but is still not enough for the war that is coming. It leaves us completely unprepared. It is crafted more defensively than offensively. And Leonard Wood in particular will receive it very coolly. General Pershing also is quite critical, but this is in his memoirs and not so much at the time. And in retrospect, a lot of people are very critical of Wilson because he does not see the connection at this time of the US having a strong military and also being influential to the efforts to like influence peace. So Wilson has this weird idea that if we are not strong militarily, somehow that's like virtuous for us, and that, I don't know. So into 1916, there are continual efforts going on both in 1915 and 1916 for peace. And it's like I said, through Wilson's back channel diplomat House. Now, in early 1916, we have the House-Gray Memorandum. So House gets together with Sir Edward Grey, and they come up with this memo that basically says that when the Allies say, Wilson will summon all the belligerents to a peace conference to put an end to the war. And should the Allies accept and Germany refuse, the United States will enter the war against Germany. Now, 5 days later, the bombardments on Verdun begin, and Grey brings it to the British War Committee, and they're not convinced of our coercive power, so it doesn't go anywhere. Meanwhile, the German embassy is continuing to lobby against US allied trade. There's German agents throughout the country that are rumored to incite strikes, conduct sabotage, blow up ships that are loaded with war material. And then in March, we have the torpedoing of the French vessel the Sussex, which injures 4 Americans. And Wilson threatens to break off diplomatic relations with Germany. In turn, the Kaiser promises to halt attacks on merchant and passenger ships without warning, and this is known as the Sussex Pledge. And funny enough, that kind of softens relations between us and Germany for a while. And then in July, the British blacklist a bunch of American firms that they believe are doing trade with the Central Powers. And not like I mentioned, a number of them are continuing to do trade through neutral countries. And through this period, our relationship with Britain actually starts to sour. Wilson gets preoccupied at the end of the year with his reelection. So he narrowly beats Republican Charles Evans Hughes. Ultimately, his base stays with him, the South, the West, and crucially, Ohio. Now, the slogan, "He kept us out of the war," is going to be used widely by the pro-Wilson camp. It's not something that Wilson himself necessarily coined or used because he knew how close we were getting to war, but it's still a very powerful message because most Americans still do not want war. Wilson notably taps into new forms of mass media, opposition research, target advertising, and also in his platform, he includes the League of Nations. So the Germans, Secretary of State Robert Lansing said, always had a genius for doing the wrong thing in the wrong way and at the wrong time. Everything changes in 1917 with the beginning of unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1, and then it just kind of goes downhill from there. I'm going to speed things up just so I can get through everything. But Wilson frames U.S. entry into the war as having this like higher purpose. He is making the world safe for democracy. He ultimately wants to shape the post-war landscape and bring the idea of the League of Nations to fruition. He also specifies in his speech that Americans are at war with the German government and not the German people. So now we are in the war. How are we going to do this thing? So although it's very controversial in the pre-war years, once war is upon us, there's no question in Wilson's mind that we need conscription. So he passes the Selective Service Act right away on May 18th, 1917. Now, selective service is a nice little rebranding by Wilson. The federal government frames it as a method to ensure that men were put in the best place to serve the war effort, which is industry or military. We have 2 national registration days, the first of which is on June 5th and includes the men ages 21 to 30. Later on, we'll expand that. And ultimately, nearly 24 million men are going to register, with more than 65% receiving an exemption. Now, most of these are occupational deferments for those serving in skilled labor. Other exemptions you could apply for were family dependency, conscientious objector, and medical. And of the 3.9 million soldiers inducted during the war, 2.8 million are conscripted. So we heavily rely on this conscripted force. At the same time, we are going to need to train these men, and we need training facilities for an estimated 900,000 men. And so carpenters and other workers are going to race to these selected sites to start basically building these training sites. And many draftees are going to arrive in September at partially completed wooden training camps and are going to have to assist in completing them themselves. Now, mass mobilization means that Americans from a variety of backgrounds, be it ethnic, religious, socioeconomic, are brought together. This is seen as an opportunity to Americanize the immigrants. Military service is viewed as a method of yanking the hyphen out of them. The War Department will rely on ethnic and cultural organizations to help us with this. Things like the YMCA, the Knights of Columbus, Salvation Army, Jewish Welfare Board. And a nice example of the diversity of the American Army is the 77th Division, which is known as the Melting Pot Division. It's filled with the hyphenated Americans from New York. It is said that the men spoke 42 different languages. The Army and American society are also going to have to confront the issue of race. Black troops are segregated, and the War Department initially wants Black troops to only be in non-combat roles. And the issues are going to start already on the home front. So in August 1917, you have an all-Black battalion of the 24th Infantry placed on guard duty at Camp Logan outside Houston, Texas. When they arrive in the Jim Crow South, everything is segregated and they're met with abuse by the white locals. There's a series of altercations between the soldiers and the Houston Police Department, and it all comes to a head when a Black private tries to stop a white officer from beating a Black woman. The officer himself is beaten, as is the corporal that is with him. The men of the 24th have had enough. The rumor comes back to them that their corporal has been killed. Over 100 mutiny march into town with their rifles and clash with police and the white locals. When all is said and done, and I've seen different numbers on this, so I think this is roughly what is right. It was 2 soldiers that were killed, 3 police officers, and 13 white civilians. Afterwards, 118 of the soldiers are arrested and court-martialed. 13 are executed in secret before their cases can be reviewed and their families can be notified. And this causes massive outrage in the Black community. So these tensions are going to continue on the home front. And then once Black troops do reach France, they're kept away from the action and relegated to menial labor duties. The exception here will be when the French start begging for American troops. Pershing is going to give them the Black troops because it is thought they'll receive greater acceptance. And a good example of this are the Harlem Hellfighters, who are pictured here, the 369th. They fight to much acclaim and come home to terrible treatment. So if you thought I was going to get through this whole presentation and not talk about Pershing, you were wrong. So I'll talk briefly about him, even though I do have a piece in the latest salient points, which goes into his background a bit more. But General John Joseph Pershing is who Wilson chooses to lead the AEF in Europe. Now, Pershing had been promoted to general in 1905 ahead of 100 more senior officers, thanks to the fact that he's buddies with Teddy Roosevelt. He also has proven himself in battle in the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, and he happens to be the son-in-law of an influential U.S. senator. Pershing is going to be the most independent of the Allied commanders. Before he departs for Europe, he's given 2 verbal orders from his Secretary of War, Newton Baker. One to go to France and the other to come home, but that in the meantime, his authority in France will be supreme. He is given total control over the extent and timing of our military cooperation. If you make good, Baker said, the people will forgive almost any mistake. If you do not make good, they will probably hang both of us on the first lamppost they can find. He heads to France in May 1917 with a small advance staff. He'll be far away from his nation's capital and any civilian oversight, and he retains his position from the beginning to the end of the war. So as soon as the United States is in the war, both the French and the British dispatch missions to Washington, and they're both competing for American manpower. They hope to have American troops fed directly into their respective forces. When Pershing departs for France, another thing he's given is a written letter that states, The underlying idea must be kept in view that the forces of the United States are a separate and distinct component of the combined forces, the identity of which must be preserved. So in effect, Wilson is in agreement, so is Secretary of War Baker. America is going to fight separately and will not just feed men into foreign armies. So there's a variety of reasons for this. One being that American troops fighting underneath foreign armies would be not politically popular. There's also concerns about morale. You've got these fresh, ready to go American troops, and they'll be side to side with French and British troops that have poor morale. You have language barriers with the French. Wilson is very concerned that if American troops are used to supplement British troops that are then relocated to other fronts in pursuit of Britain's imperial territories, that's not going to fly with Wilson. He has this great idea that America's not fighting for territory, we're fighting for an ideal. But ultimately, it's all because Wilson wants to have a say in the post-war order. And the only way for that to happen is if the American contribution can be measurable. And this is going to be a source of tension throughout the war, especially as the Americans slowly build up their force and are very poorly trained. So cooperation with the British is rejected, as is the placement of our army at the juncture in the British and French lines. Pershing and the staff try and decide where is the best place to fight, and they decide it's Lorraine. They like Lorraine because many of his staff studied the Franco-Prussian War, and they're familiar with the area around Metz, and in their mind, it's very strategically important. It also has a lot of rail lines and access to the port of Saint-Nazaire, and it's more freely available for shipping down there than it would be in the Channel. And it's also right now a relatively inactive front that would allow for training, and Pershing thought somewhere that the Americans might independently operate and play a decisive role. Now, his eyes are on 1919. They're not on 1917, and they're definitely not on 1918 either. They have this forward thinking into 1919, as that is the timing and the place in which they'll play their decisive role. At the same time, American war planners are going to emphasize open warfare. The infantrymen, the rifle, and the bayonet just flies in the face of everything the French and the British have learned. It's actually very similar to French and British approaches in 1914, but we don't take the lessons learned from our allies. We don't recognize the importance of the machine gun or heavy artillery. We assign them a secondary role. So the doughboys that receive training from the French or British are going to be better off because they will be trained in trench warfare tactics, but this is going to be fought from the higher ups, and it's a major failure of American command. We also have a lot of logistical issues. We have no shipping, once again. We've commandeered some Austrian and British ships, but we mostly have to rely on Britain to get our troops across the ocean. We have no artillery, tanks, or machine guns. And throughout the war, no American-made cannon or shell, no American-made tank is going to be used. So we rely heavily on the French and some British equipment. And it's a very slow buildup of our forces, which is very frustrating for our allies. The summer of 1918, we see everything speed up a bit more, and American doughboys start arriving in France in the tens of thousands each month. Back on the home front, we have a variety of agencies that are created by Wilson to help the war effort. One of them is the Committee on Public Information. And this is headed by a journalist named George Creel. He's a muckraker, if you guys know that term. So the Committee on Public Information is there to provide guidance to newspapers not to publish anything that could pose a national security threat. They hire journalists that go abroad with the army, and they also have these 4 Minutemen that are citizen volunteers. They go around in the community and give speeches and advocate for the war and advocate for buying Liberty bonds. And they also have a division of pictorial publicity that creates propaganda posters like the famous Uncle Sam and patriotic films. Now, propaganda right away starts out in tone very positive and pro-America, and then it starts to shift and become darker, more xenophobic and anti-German. So anti-German hysteria starts to develop. Now, German Americans are going to be often bullied into buying war bonds, kissing the flag, singing the national anthem, etc. in public. Some jurisdictions start to ban the use of the German language. They start to ban instruction in German. There's instances of violence against German Americans. There's one of lynching in Collinsville, Illinois. A man named Robert Prager is thought to be a spy. He's taken into protective police custody, but a mob breaks into the jail and hangs him by a tree. So how do German Americans respond to this? Well, for one, they start to shift suspicion away from themselves by reporting others that they think are disloyal. German American institutions are also going to start removing the Germanic terms from their names. One example here on the right is a picture of the statue of Germania being removed from the Germania Life Insurance building in St. Paul, Minnesota, which was renamed the Guardian Life Insurance. They'll also, publicize their participation in Red Cross activities, buy war bonds, etc. And German Americans are not the only targets. Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, or the Wobblies, they're a faction of the labor movement that opposes the war. They're also going to be targeted, and they're targeted by a lot of organizations that are created by the government. So Wilson passes the Espionage Act. This provides broad powers to prosecute people for treason, insurrection, resisting U.S. law, makes it a crime to share information, anything about American national security that could injure the United States, and it gives massive power to the Postmaster General to halt treasonous mailings. The Postmaster General is a guy named Albert Sidney Burleson, and he is super ready to use his powers. House comments in 1918 that Burleson was, quote, in a belligerent mood against the Germans, against labor, against the pacifists, etc. He is now the most belligerent member of the cabinet. And Wilson, for his part, is going to do very little to oppose these rampages. There's also a Trading with the Enemy Act in October 1917 that targets foreign language journals. There is an executive order in November 1917 that all German aliens in the country have to register with the federal authorities. That's that registration card you'll see there. All non-naturalized men over the age of 13 have to report to a U.S. attorney's office or post office to register and be interviewed. They have their photo taken and they're fingerprinted. And we also later on have the Sedition Act. This just expands the powers. You cannot speak out against the Liberty Bond sales, the draft, the flag, military service, or soldiers in uniform. And what all of this means is that we have an unprecedented suppression of civil liberties in American society. And it's just a huge hypocritical moment to be fighting a war for democracy abroad, but curtailing it at home. I mentioned Herbert Hoover was leading the CRB. Well, he's so successful that Wilson asks him to head the Food Administration. And while we are lucky enough to have a healthy food production in our country, the demands of feeding an army in addition to feeding our allies puts a strain on that. So we never have any formal rationing in the United States, at least not on the federal level. The focus is instead on pressuring businesses and individuals to use food substitutions, limit uses of wheat, sugar, meat, and fats. This is when we get the popularity of peanut butter. And it's all an appeal to patriotism, meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, and we have victory gardens like the one here. And lastly, another thing that's going to throw a wrench in our plans in the war is the flu. So it's pretty widely accepted now that the Spanish flu actually began in the United States with a first reported case in rural Kansas in February of 1918. And it travels to Camp Funston. So Camp Funston is the second largest cantonment with 56,000 troops. It is overcrowded, it's cold, the tents are poorly ventilated, and then these troops are going to head to the Atlantic seaboard and head to Europe. And that is how the flu will spread. There's 3 waves of it, the most lethal of one of which is from August to December. And the spread of it is not helped by the fact that we have big parades happening in major cities in September and October. The flu is going to have an impact on both the labor force at home and also our ability to fight, particularly in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So I'll start to wrap things up a little bit here, talk about some of the impacts that the war had on America. Starting with the Army. So this is all just a bunch of statistics from the U.S. Army Center of Military History showing the massive buildup of forces we had in the span of 18 months. And it was a monumental task. It lays the foundations for the modern U.S. Army. And the war is ultimately a huge learning experience for us. The AEF's numerical superiority is going to compensate for our lack of experience and help tip the scale in the Allies' favor. Casualties are listed there, just shy of 250,000, and the majority of these are going to be from the months of May through November. Pales in comparison to what the other combatants suffer, but it is the greatest number of war deaths we've had since the Civil War. The Meuse-Argonne offensive remains the largest U.S. offensive in U.S. military history, and the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery is the largest American cemetery in Europe. In 1919, Wilson is going to give families the option to have their loved ones brought home. So between 1921 and 1923, more than 45,000 of the fallen are repatriated back to the United States, including my 2 family members that served. And I do believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, that we were the only country to repatriate our war dead. We also have a Gold Star Mother's pilgrimage that happens between 1930 and 1933. It's funded by the government, and approximately 7,000 mothers will travel to the Western Front. The impact on American society. So all throughout the war, Wilson has felt that the U.S.'s contribution should serve some greater purpose. He has his 14 points that he outlines for the Treaty of Versailles. The chief one among these are the principle of self-determination. And he, above all, wants to have the League of Nations, international body to make war impossible via collective security. So he successfully includes this in the Treaty of Versailles, but he spends a lot of time in Europe working to make the peace treaty happen, and he neglects to sell it to the American people at home. He's also never been very good at working across the aisle, and he doesn't include any moderate Republicans in his peace delegation. And so all of this comes to bite him in the butt, basically. He returns home to go on a campaign throughout the country to get Congress to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. But while he's doing this campaign, he suffers a stroke and falls into ill health. And eventually the Senate's going to defeat the treaty, and Wilson himself will be defeated in the election of 1920. However, the war does demonstrate our raw power, our potential for industrial production, military mobilization, and we also begin to build up our Navy. However, due to the failure of the League of Nations, also when Americans see the French and the British kind of breaking up the Middle East, there's going to be increasing sourness and a feeling that the US got duped into joining a conflict in which they didn't need to be in. So we have a bit of a retreat to isolationism following the end of the war. The paranoia brought on by the war empowered the government and empowered them to use surveillance agencies, and they use the war as an excuse, but it's just going to continue into the years following the end of the war, particularly the Red Scare, which is the fear against communism. Black veterans are going to come back home with pride in their accomplishment, but bitterness at their treatment back home. There's the Red Summer of 1919, which is an outbreak of racial violence in at least 26 cities throughout the US. As a result, the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, it grows significantly in the wake of the war. So we do see some gains made in the civil rights movement. And also, like I mentioned, the Great Migration is accelerated by this. Immigration-wise, I also mentioned earlier that we had increasing anti-immigration sentiment. Well, this becomes institutionalized with literacy tests, numerical limits on immigration, and quotas based off of where they're coming from. And lastly, we entered the war a debtor, but we do leave it a creditor. And we've had a lot of talk in this course about debt. And so I found this chart. I thought you guys would find it interesting. I actually pulled it from the American Battle Monuments Commission. They have their booklet called American Armies and Battlefields in Europe. And I'm happy to send this around later, but I thought it was really interesting to look at. So to conclude everything, I started with a quote, I'll end with a quote. I was reading this book by John Maurice Clark. It's a very dry book about industry in the war, but he had these great lines, and this was one in particular that I really liked. So the war gave us a proven sense of capacity for national accomplishment, which was decidedly lacking before 1917. Then we were a nation of self-confident people, but we were not a self-confident nation. We could not have done it alone with our own resources alone, not in 1918. Let us always remember that. Yet it is also good to remember that the thing was done. So thank you for having me, and I hope you learned something.
Thank you, Ali. What a fantastic talk. I mean, that was a real tour de force.